Okay, we should be set.
Thank you so much, Summer. And thanks for everyone coming together at 5:30 today on March 9th, 2021 for this pre-council meeting workshop. Let's see. Vehicular noise, discussion among council members and staff of actions the city can take to mitigate vehicular noise, amending our noise ordinance, noise and speed limit enforcement, a recreation opportunity spectrum analysis, and city participation in noise mitigation efforts on public lands, just to name a few. So I'm very grateful that we're all coming together. And for this workshop, I know that Joel shared with the council kind of a loose, some structure to our meeting, but I do want to just read that now. My goodness, give me just one moment. That the structure of our workshop is to talk about, where we're going moving forward. We're going to start with a summary from Lori about what the city has done, what we actually have taken action on as a city. And then we're going to move into a list of mitigation efforts. Number one, revising our noise ordinance. Number two, looking at our enforcement. Number three, visitation data collection. Number four, coordination with others. And number five, other ideas that we have received from vendors for consideration and community for consideration. And then finally, we want to make time where we can discuss the topic of the land use ordinance and when we discussed before regarding fleet size, just to make sure that we're clear with direction for council. So, and then I also want to just make sure that we also have time at the end of this workshop to be able to be really clear about how we are scheduling future consideration items as agenda items. So without further ado, Lori, why don't you kick us off with what we actually factually have in place with respect to noise mitigation efforts from the city.
Great, thank you. So in summary, on October 13th, 2020, the City Council at a regularly held meeting discussed options available to the city to mitigate OHV ATV noise. And then on October 20th, 2020, at a joint meeting with the county, the City Council and the County Commission discussed options for mitigating OHV ATV noise. And at that meeting, the city instituted a 15-mile-an-hour OHV speed limit on city streets by ordinance number 2020-15. On the same day, the city also placed a moratorium on new business licenses for ATV-related uses, as well as a moratorium on special event permits for ATV uses. On February 9th, 2021, the council at a regularly held meeting tabled a proposed ordinance that would have enacted a temporary land use regulation prohibiting for a period of 180 days development or possibly expansion of vehicle sales, rentals, or leasing, commercial outdoor recreational uses, commercial recreational tour companies, outfitters, and guide services as they pertain to all terrain vehicles. The last thing I'd just like to point out is that the state law currently remains the same with regard to what tools the city has at its disposal to regulate ATV and OHV noise.
Thank you for that summary, Laurie. I think it's really helpful to know there's just a lot of chatter around OHV everything, but also noise pollution mitigation. And so it's really helpful as we move forward into this discussion and for those that watch this discussion to know where we are and where we are not, because there's still some confusion about whether or not certain things passed in certain ways. So thank you, Lori, for that concise list from the city of what we have actually done, the action that we have taken.
You're welcome.
And I just want to point out, we've been talking about how to measure our efforts. And it's probably worth noting that just this meeting alone, this 1.5-hour meeting, times the number of staff and council members that are participating, we really are doing what we can to address the noise pollution in our valley. And what Laurie didn't list is definitely a long list of each one of us, council and staff, meeting with others, talking, brainstorming, thinking, efforts that go all the way back to before I was even mayor, and maybe most of you on council with the Throttle Down in Town effort. So we've been doing this for a really long time, and there's been a lot of effort, and Laurie just listed the steps that we've actually taken. So I just wanted to make a nod to the hours and hours and hours that we've all spent on this issue. But now, Joel, I'll just turn it over to you if you want to list again the mitigation efforts we're going to be talking about tonight.
Yep. So I provided council a list of 6 things. The mitigation efforts we're going to talk about tonight first would be to revise the noise ordinance and what that looks like going forward. We'll have a couple presentations real quick on that, and then we will be discussing the noise ordinance enforcement and what that looks like. That's why Brett's with us tonight. Then we will talk about visitor data and what the different user groups and what we can maybe do to try and get that information to go forward. Our coordination with the other governments. I've been meeting with the vendors of the ATV, OHV rental companies and been talking to them. I haven't met with all of them yet, but in the next coming days, I will be doing that. Those conversations have been really good so far. We would like to talk about access points to getting to certain trails in certain areas here in the community and how we can maybe reroute some of those. The commercial entry aspect to some of those access points to try and clear up congestion, the permit process that we discussed earlier in the fall, a curfew, which we tried to run through the legislature, and a trailering requirement. And then lastly, the land use ordinance and fleet size restrictions, some of the other things we've discussed going forward. So that's kind of what we're looking at tonight. Mayor, I'll turn it back over to you.
I just want to encourage us to be really good with our time. We've got 2 presentations right off the bat, one from Les and then one from Councilmember Duncan. And because of that long list, I just want to make sure that I'm going to keep us moving through these topics so that we can hit them all with still time left to talk about future agenda items. Okay, so if I start pushing to wrap up, that's where it's coming from, just because there's a lot for us to discuss. So item number 1, the revision of our noise ordinance. So Joel and Laurie, if you want to take this back and just set us up for the topic and then also the presentations.
Joel, do you want to do an introduction or do you want me to do it?
I'll let you do it.
Okay. Well, I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Les Blumberg. He is expert the city is working with, who has offered to be at the presentation or our meeting this evening to make a short presentation about what efforts he has experience in revising noise ordinances for other municipalities. And in particular, he's had an opportunity to look at our noise ordinance and has some ideas about revising ours. So with that, Mr. Blumberg, would you like to take over?
All right. Hey, thank you very much. So my name is Les Blumberg. I'm the executive director of the Noise Pollution Clearinghouse. It's a national nonprofit. I've been the director for 25 years. And my experience and my expertise is in noise policy. I've got a lot of experience evaluating noise ordinances. I've evaluated the noise ordinances of the 500 largest cities in the United States and written a series of 7 papers on that topic. I'm a member of the American National Standards Institute Standards Committee, so I understand standards and noise. I've been doing noise measurements for 25 years. I've been training police officers and noise control officials in noise enforcement. I've helped communities revise noise ordinances. So that's kind of my background. I've looked at your noise ordinance. In general, the noise ordinance needs a little revision. It needs revision because it doesn't have any daytime limits. The nighttime limits that it has are a couple, you're outliers. You're amongst the least protective noise ordinances in the nighttime in the country. The whole issue could be kind of mute because if you read one of the clauses, 1774-080-080, it looks like the noise from ATVs is prohibited already, but so is the noise from cars and trucks and everything else. And so I think it's another reason why your noise ordinance needs to get revised, is that you haven't quite accomplished what you want. I'm going to try, how much time? You got a couple more minutes or not? Yep. So I'd like to share my screen. Did you give me permission to do that? Let's see here. Did that work? Are you guys seeing my screen? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. So what I have here, let me go up to the top here. So I just wanted to talk to you about some of the regulatory tools you can use to deal with motor vehicles and mobile noise sources. And when I evaluate these, I'm going to use, since I've got very little time, I just picked 3 criteria that I think are important. Is it comprehensive? Does it cover all of the noise that comes out of these vehicles and all of the instances when the vehicles are being used? Is it easy to use? Will the police officers have an easy time in using this to enforce the laws? And 3, is it inexpensive or is it expensive to use? So those are my criteria. I can give you a much more nuanced criteria, but not in the time I have. Here's the regulatory tools I see available to you. You can use equipment requirements, like requiring a muffler. You can use something like an EPA stamp. Motorcycles and dirt bikes are required to have a stamp on their muffler, and you can just do a visual inspection and see that stamp. You can use either a 25 or a 50-foot drive-by test, where you just set a noise meter up at the side of the road and 50 feet or 25 feet from the road and measure the vehicles as they go by. And if they exceed a certain limit, they're in violation. You can use a 20-inch test. This is a stationary test where the vehicle is tested 20 inches from the exhaust pipe. And then you run the vehicle up to about 50% of their red line. Or you can use a plainly audible at a distance standard. What you do is you're using your ear instead of a sound level meter. You move generally a long ways away. If you can hear it at that distance, it's in violation. If you can't, it's not. You can use setbacks and you can use time of day restrictions. Those 2 probably apply more to private property, but they might also, depending on state law, apply to your trails too, and they might be useful in that sense. So you might at least keep them in mind as tools that you can use. And just to wrap up, I just wanted to kind of mention what I see as the advantages and disadvantages of each one of these. There is no perfect noise standard and noise tool. Each one has advantages and disadvantages. I recommend communities use them all, because sometimes one of the tools will allow an officer to get in and out of there really fast, okay? But other times you're gonna have to do a more complicated one. But you definitely wanna have them all so that if you can use a cheap and inexpensive tool, you can use that and not have to go to your most expensive and most difficult one right away. So what I see, the equipment requirement, it's not comprehensive because it's just a muffler. It only catches the worst offenders. It's uncertain whether it's easy or not because it's hard to make a judgment of whether a vehicle actually has a muffler sometimes, but it is inexpensive. The officer just looks at it. The EPA stamp, it's not comprehensive because it only covers motorcycles and dirt bikes. But it is easy because you just look at it, and if it's got the stamp, it goes, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. And it's inexpensive. It doesn't require any training or equipment. The the 25 or 50-foot drive-by, that's comprehensive. That catches all the noise of the vehicle. The problem is it's not as easy to use. It's more difficult to use. And it's expensive because you got to get the meter, you got to get the training. For the 20-inch test, that is similar, but it's not comprehensive because it only measures engine noise. There's a lot of other noises on a vehicle, drivetrain and tire noise, that are also emanating into the community, sometimes at equal or greater amounts than the engine noise. And so the 20-inch test doesn't necessarily correlate to what the community is experiencing. So it's not necessarily comprehensive. It's not easy to use either. It's just like the other one. It requires a decibel meter. And so therefore it's not inexpensive. It's expensive because you got to get the meter out. The plainly audible test. That one's comprehensive because you're out in the neighborhood, you're hearing all the noise, you're getting all the noise. Problem is, you guys have a very quiet background, and that may make this an unworkable standard in your community. It's used, for example, in New York City for motorcycles, but the distance is like a couple hundred feet, and New York City's got a louder background level, but you guys have a very quiet background level. So it's not clear to me it will work for sure. The other ones, they're not comprehensive, and you can read those. I think I've used up my time.
Well, we are very grateful for that list, and we are very grateful to have you here with us tonight. And as we move through all of these different suggestions, I'm sure we're all saying, oh, well, number 7, time of day, we're restricted by our state legislature. We just found that our legislature is not yet willing to allow us to restrict time of day and set a curfew. So that is not, unfortunately, a tool for us at this time.
Can you do that on the trails though? Or is that just on the roadways? Because if you can do that on the trails, it's a land use law in your trails. So we are
the city of Moab, and we only have jurisdiction within our municipality. So that's a really good clarifying point. That's what we're talking about tonight. What we as the city can do, go ahead and unshare your screen. That's what we as the city can do within our municipal boundary, and then how we can work with others to achieve the noise standard that we hope to have in our valley, which is ultimately the achievement of quality of life. So thank you so much for that presentation. Now we'll move to, are we doing discussion, or am I kicking it over to Mike now for his presentation? Mike next. Yes. Okay. Okay, Mike, take it away. And then I think we talked, oh, sorry, you're muted. And I think we talked about the same sort of time limit, 5 to 7 minutes. Does that work for you, Mike?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, stand by. Sorry about that.
We can see your screen, it looks like, and your screen has the on it. So
tab that's covering up.
If you minimize that, there you go.
Yeah, but the tab I need to pull up that presentation, which I've preloaded, is behind. There we go. Got it. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. So ladies and gentlemen, I wrote this presentation really not so much for council. You guys are familiar with much of this, but for our broader audience, to let them know what we haven't done and so forth. Let me just touch on the high points. Les, I want to thank you for your presentation. It's comforting to hear because you're saying pretty much the same things that many of us have proposing, either a pass by or a stationary test, or both in some combination. And let me just, to keep this real short, Emily, that's fine. I want to point out, by the way, that the stationary test and pass-by test, that as I've drafted it and sent to Lori, does not discriminate strictly against ATVs. It discriminates against any loud vehicle with certain exceptions, like it doesn't cover commercial vehicles, for example, but loud motorcycles, allowed pickup trucks, allowed anything that goes over a certain dB limit would be flagged just like an ATV would. And Les, I want to ask you if we have time. We've all observed that there's a distinctive whine to the transmissions of ATVs. That's what enables our ear to pick them out a long ways away. If you just measure them with a noise meter, ATVs come in, noisy ones come in a little above the crowd, so to speak, but there's not too many dB of gap between there. So we would end up flagging a number of non-UTV type vehicles that are noisy, and which is, but anyway, I just want to point out that the ordinance as I've drafted anyway is not specific to ATVs, which ought to blunt this business about it being discriminatory against ATVs. Cliff Kuntz said that with a suitable tailpipe muffler retrofit kit, $500, maybe $1,000. Cliff, we can make them comparably quiet to a passenger car. And I offer the opinion that while that expense is significant, it's not prohibitive in terms of the cost of the vehicle itself. And I took a closer look at the ordinance that Cliff just suggested, the existing noise ordinance. And I'm not really quite sure. I wanted to ask Brett about this, about if it's ever been enforced and why we haven't. I will further add that 65 dB at 25 feet is pretty quiet, okay? I say that because I've done a number of roadside measurements at more like 12 feet, about half that distance, and noisy vehicles tend to be in the low 80s, maybe high 70s at the quietest. And you cut 6 dB off in order to back off by a factor of 2, and you're still gonna be well above 65 dBA. So Les is correct, that number, Laurie is correct, that number is gonna have to be changed, otherwise we'd be flagging everything in sight. But nonetheless, the rest of the ordinance looks to me with certain little kind of queasy little loopholes in here that it would work. Already talked about that. Brett reported last week that to his ear anyway, that ATVs, at least on level roads at 15 miles an hour when they're not accelerating, are comparably quiet to ordinary personal cars. Brett, without disagreeing with you of what you heard at all, what I hear is that distinctive whine, which really sets them off. But at any rate, I would love to get a noise meter out at 15 miles an hour. I know we did this with Cliff, and try it again. One of the things I want to suggest to all you guys is that we could go around to the shops in town and take a wider sample of their fleets, both at 15, 25 mile an hour stationary and muffler test. And that way we would know before we ever finalize any ordinances what the dB limits ought to be, rather than just taking a wild stab at it and then having to change it later on. So we talked about pass by and stationary. I maintain there's nothing show-stopping about pass by test. The criteria is pretty simple. Can't have extraneous noise sources. You can't have another vehicle right behind the one you're trying to target. Can't be windy, blah, blah, blah. You can't have fences reflecting noise, that kind of thing. I'm sure Les would agree with me on that. And that's all something that's relatively easy to do with a trained officer. And Emily, I think I'll just stop right there. I've kind of said the gist of what I wanted to say, so I think I will stop. So back to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike. I'm very appreciative of your time that you have spent in digging deeper into DBs and putting that together. I'm very appreciative.
You're welcome.
Nice to have an engineer that speaks that language. Speak that language for us. So, okay, well, council, I would like for us to just, I would like to open the conversation for all of us. And again, each one of these topics, we're going to have, a little bit of time to touch on each one with a hopeful, consensus around action item moving forward. So revision of our noise ordinance. Kaylin, you also put some effort into noise ordinance. So I just want to give you a little bit of time to speak to that.
Oh, thank you. So from what I'm hearing from both Mike and Les, as well as my own impressions, is that pass by test is both more difficult, or at least there's more uncontrolled, difficult to control variables than a stationary test, but it seems like having it in our toolkit could be useful. My understanding is that we don't need to enforce all ordinances in all instances immediately. We can have them on the books, and then we could potentially proceed cautiously. Like we can start small under the most controlled circumstances, since this will be new terrain for all of us, especially the law enforcement officers and the prosecutor. Perhaps with a stationary test under the most controlled condition, and then experiment with pass-by tests at relatively quiet locations. And that may not even be in the city. We may just be, in effect, being supportive of the county, since they might have locations which are quiet, inherently quieter and with fewer vehicles. But it does seem that getting, as Les said, getting all these, as many tools as we feel is appropriate on the books now, because as we've heard from our residents and from our own experience, we have a really significant health and well-being problem here. And so I'd just like to move forward with as many tools as we can at this time.
Okay, and let's just really get specific about this noise ordinance, because I think this council will be very willing to see on our agenda a revised noise ordinance. So there's kind of two parts from what I understand. And Joel, could you speak to the two parts of looking at and amending our noise ordinance?
Yeah, so you're speaking of the criminal civil aspect of this, is that correct, Mayor?
Yeah, I want you to just go deep in that legal talk so that we can all try to understand it a little more specifically. And then also the planning side as well.
So what we've talked about doing, because we've talked several times about some of the challenges of enforcing these noise ordinances and the aspect of them being a criminal code and reasonable suspicion and probable cause and all the elements we have to meet in order to seek out a prosecution, we've talked about moving this over into a civil form for enforcement, which would require us to form an ALJ, administrative law judge, and a civil due process court in order to process those. The requirements for a pullover and a stop in a site are less than that. There's no potential jail or driving point accumulation, and the penalties aren't as stiff, and therefore the requirements or the enforcement aren't as stiff as well. And so we've talked about moving this from a criminal aspect to a civil aspect, similar to a parking ticket, or if you got a fine from code enforcement for your yard not being in order or having outside storage or debris, and putting it into that realm rather than in a DUI or a drug possession realm of a criminal case. And so Lori's really been working on that aspect of it. In the past, other places I've worked, we've set up ALJs and civil courts, and we can do that process. And then the person who writes the tickets and enforces that ordinance isn't law enforcement. You could pass that responsibility on to someone who isn't post-certified. And so you can have just an employee, basically like a meter maid who enforces parking enforcing officer who enforces the parking tickets. You could have them enforcing the noise side of this as well. Through a civil side of it. And so that's the legwork we've been putting in, that Lori's really been working on, trying to get that side figured out and then move it out of the criminal realm. And we think that that's a good way to do this. We feel it's a lot more, puts the city in a better situation to defend it upon its challenge. The standards are a lot less and the penalties are a lot less. We could have it be enhanceable, and after the second penalty, so the third time you got a ticket, it could be criminal at that point, and there'd be a different standard that started being applied, but you'd have to have almost like a 3 strikes rule before you went into the criminal realm of things, to a driving record and actually paying a court and going into that fine structure. So That's the main thing that we've been working on, trying to figure out how to do that. And that would also help with enforcement, because the people involved with that enforcement don't have to be sworn officers, and you can fill those positions easier than trying to get someone who's sworn to do this type of work.
Can you also speak to where our noise ordinance currently lives?
Yeah.
Where, what efforts we could take to, and have been considering to put it in the right place in code. So, and yeah, thank you.
Yep. So for some reason, our noise ordinance is in our land use code, which doesn't make a lot of sense. It should be health and safety. This is noise pollution. This is a public health nuisance. It should be in our health and safety code. So we started taking the steps to move it out of our land use ordinance and put it into our health and safety chapter of our city code. That will be on for public hearing on Thursday night before the Planning Commission, where the Planning Commission will consider that for recommendation to come to City Council. Whether they give that a favorable recommendation or a non-favorable recommendation, that will still come to the council at our next meeting, where we will then vote to move it into health and safety. And at that point, it'll be in the proper section of our code where it's currently not. And at that point, we can, at our meeting following that, we would have something on the agenda for adoption or for consideration, at least to adopt or to amend our noise ordinance in order for us to be able to start enforcing it and go the route that this council directs staff to take it.
So then just one more thing. So so there's the concept of moving the noise ordinance into a different part of code, and then revising the noise ordinance for all of the reasons that have been stated in all of the ways. But then also, because we're talking about criminal versus civil, can you talk about the consequences too? Because that's been a question.
Yeah, so under a civil penalty, there's no threat of jail time. There's no threat of loss of your driving privilege. It's just a fine. It's, like I said earlier, similar to code enforcement. If code enforcement writes you a ticket for having outdoor storage or debris in your yard, you just have to pay a fine. There's not really much of a action item that the city can take against you beyond that. So there'd be no threat of jail time. There'd be no threat of losing your license. There'd be no right to an attorney at any point in that process. You would have a due process right, and that due process right would go through a civil court, through a civil process, an administrative law judge, and they would have a right to challenge it. But like I said, the burden is no longer beyond a reasonable doubt. It's preponderance of the evidence, and that's a much easier burden to meet in that standard.
And then one more very specific process question, because we want to get this ordinance right. We do have Les that's joining us. So can you speak to who will be drafting the ordinance that will then come before this council?
So this meeting tonight, we're hoping to get direction as to what exactly we're wanting to see in that ordinance. Myself and Lori and Carly will work with Les to draft that ordinance with Les's guidance, with his professional acumen and background, and with Lori's expertise in the legal side of things to prepare that ordinance to bring it forward to council.
Excellent. Okay, is there anything else regarding the noise ordinance sort of process and then what it would go in that you want to share?
I think that's about it.
Okay, let's turn it to council for questions and discussion. Ronnie, I saw your hand first, and then Tawny.
I have a bunch of questions from me and residents that I think are relevant to this part of the discussion. So I'm just marking the ones that seem relevant right now. Joel, in the county meeting on March 2nd, there was a reference to a fine for, I think, a noise violation being $720. Is that fixed by the state? And would that be something, people have wondered if a community can change that, and it might matter if it's civil versus criminal. So I was gonna let you comment on that, because people are also thinking, oh, this, the city can make a ton of money that way. And I know you've commented before that municipalities only keep a small percentage of a ticket, and I can't remember if the rest goes upstate. So I was just gonna ask you to re-educate us all.
So that's a really, really good question. In a criminal matter, the city does only keep a small portion of the fine. Now, in a civil matter, the city would keep the majority of that. We'd keep pretty much all of that fine. We'd have to pay our ALJ and costs that are associated with it. So I don't want to make it sound like we'd be making money. We'd have to hire an administrative law judge to hear these cases as people were challenging them. So there'll be costs associated with this. And if we have to hire non-post certified officers to enforce it, there'll be cost in that as well. So I think sometimes people hear that we're getting a fine and all of a sudden we're making money. Well, most of the time the fines don't override the overhead that comes with the enforcement of that ordinance. But nonetheless, that fine would be retained by the city. There are caps depending on how we do this as to what our fine would be. I would not expect our fine to be anywhere near that realm. I would be much lower than that.
Okay, and then, sorry, I'm just going to go through these. So I've received a number of questions from the public about some concerns that if you have a decibel level up in the 90s, and I know we haven't set one yet, but that might be, you know, too loud. And so they're just wondering what the common decibel level of a street vehicle is. And it sounds like it might be in the 70s or 80s, but I have received questions about why it couldn't be set at that level, or if it can be.
So this is a part of the confusion for this discussion that a lot of people are having. This 90 to 95 decibel reading that people are hearing and talking about, that's being measured from 20 inches from the tailpipe. No one's standing 20 inches from a tailpipe as a car as it goes down the road. So that 90 to 95 decibel of a side-by-side that's being measured 20 inches from a tailpipe is not what the decibel range of a side-by-side will be is you're standing 20 feet from it on the curb. And so
do you have any idea what, say like a F-150 or something coming out of, you know, people have just asked, like, you know, standard truck SUV when it comes off the line, how would it compare at 20 inches? Just to give them some.
I'm willing to bet that Les knows that.
Yeah, so the there's a lot of data published by the Federal Highway Administration about noise levels of vehicles of different types, and I think I think it would be best for me to prepare something and share that with you, because the problem with it is noise decreases with distance, and so if you hear that, if I tell you that an ATV is 90 decibels, I'm right. If I tell you it's 30 decibels, I'm right. It just matters where I measured it from. And so, you know, I think it's a type of thing that just leads to a lot of confusion, because you got to specify a distance every time you do it. And the other thing is a 20-inch distance doesn't correlate well with a 50-foot distance.
Okay,
and
well,
so,
eventually, in terms of tools, it would probably be great for our residents and council to just have some kind of comparison, so people know. I mean, in the same playing field. Like,
I think that's right. I think they should have that, and I can prepare that for you and show that to you. But it would, I think I would just add to more confusion if I told people a number right.
Yeah, no, it's fine. This is just to educate us all so we can be on the same.
And Ronnie, can I just speak to that question that you're asking? Because I think for the purpose of this council and this noise ordinance, what staff needs to hear, no pun intended, loud and clear, is that that what level is acceptable to us, whether it's a car, a UTV, a motorcycle, a semi-truck, you know, that we say what is acceptable per unit, and where do we want to sort of create that that level of that standard. And so I think it's important for us as a council not to get so bogged down in the decibel levels, but instead really start to focus on that sound standard.
Okay, well, I mean, obviously for enforcement purposes, they probably will need a number. So I'm just throwing this out there because residents have said to me, why can't they be as loud as other cars? So if you guys need a standard for me, that's what my residents are telling me. But
say that again, because I think that's a juicy statement. Can you say that again?
You know, just at the same level as other cars. I mean, we all know, you know, and nobody here is picking on OHVs. You know, everybody has their issue. My residents are happy to, you know, have this same standard be going after loud motorcycles and trucks. And personally, I'd be happy to go after semis, but it sounds like they aren't part of this. You know, noise is noise. And this isn't, in the greater scheme, this isn't about OHVs, it's about noise. So, but that's what people are saying, you know, standard vehicle. maybe up to an F-150, because it's one of the bigger ones if you're going to err on the arc, one side of the arc. But anyway, I know other people have questions, but there just are a bunch. So at some point, I assume we're going to get down the line into some lists with the money we have to spend and what different things cost, so we can figure out where we get the most bang for our bucks. But just a few other points specific to the noise ordinance that residents made. Among other things, that, when you're riding your OHV or other vehicles that are, loud, you don't necessarily hear the noise because you might have a helmet on or you might have earplugs on. So just some things to keep in mind. Along something that I feel like is parallel enough with the noise ordinance that we've gotten requests for from residents in our toolbox is the request that for local outfitters that we can put some kind of signs or color codes or numbers or something on the vehicles. It just makes it that much easier to tell if a vehicle is with a specific outfitter. And comments have been made in our past meetings that they really aren't the problem, but that will at least help educate and help people from a distance see, oh, okay, well, this isn't an outfitter. So then it helps us collect some data on where some of that is. But that's one request that residents have been making. And then I just wanted to clarify from listening to the county meeting when they were talking about stationary stops. It does sound like we need to get permission from a court to do those. Is that correct, whether it's civil or criminal? And if so, that we might be limited to 2 to 4 a year. So I just wanted to make sure we had that out from the beginning. And then also, like, to properly man them, that we're probably going to need the city and the county law enforcement all on deck on the same day. So it really needs to be coordinated well in advance so that everybody is available to handle both the stationary stop and everything else going on in town. So those were all things when I listened to the meetings that seemed important to me.
We are working with the county on creating those stops. It is accurate because you normally, to make a traffic stop, you have to have reasonable suspicion to make that stop. In a situation where you're stopping everyone, you don't have that reasonable suspicion. So you are required to go to a court, to a judge, and get him to sign off on essentially what's a warrant to hold that traffic stop. And you have to say what you're looking for and what you're going to cite for. And then the judge has to sign off on it. Then we're required to give notice in public papers and other public areas where that will be and what times it will be. So we give complete public notice and awareness as to when we're going to hold those stops. And that's what gets us around that. It's an illegal stop because we've given notice what we're looking for, published all of it. It's all out there. People should be aware that that's happening.
And Ronnie, just so you know, we are working with the county. I'd like to thank the county quite a bit because the county attorney has been doing legwork to file the application with the court and is going to work with us. And so we are in coordination with our police department are working on that.
Okay, I want to pass and let someone else ask questions about noise ordinances.
Yeah, I just want to, though, tease out from your questions too, because we're talking about the noise ordinance. So what I'm hearing is standards at or around regular vehicular noise or common vehicular noise. I'm also hearing well, not so much the one about the enforcement, but before that, the question of, oh shoot, I should have written it down.
One of the ones that I wrote down, Mayor, was to require outfitters to be clearly marked.
Yeah, so our ordinance could have some type of labeling of, okay. So thanks, Ronnie. Tawny?
Joel, mine are pretty easy and they can be really quick. They're more along budgetary lines. We'll call them meter maids because I don't know a better word for it right now. If we were to have meter maids that were not post-certified officers, what kind of qualifications would we require and how many can we likely hire?
The qualifications will basically be standard qualifications for employment. There won't be any certifications of law enforcement or anything like that. Obviously, we'd look for people who have a skill set for that type of work and to be able to put up with that type of working environment. Law enforcement have a really hard job and deal with really unhappy people all the time. So we would look for someone who could kind of work in that field. As far as how many of them can we hire, that's always just a question of what our priorities are and where we spend our money. And as we bring in the budget to you guys, that's That's a decision that we would make going forward. Obviously, we don't have money laying around to hire a bunch of employees, because we would do that if we did, because we have other areas we could use help. So, but we could definitely, if we needed a couple, we could figure out how to make that work, and other areas we could make cuts to make that situation happen.
I think overall too, just kind of a running total of what things cost, what this, as we go into budget season, we're hiring a new finance director. So, in budgeting, there's like line items like noise pollution mitigation. But
I mean,
in all seriousness, we're not tracking staff hours trying to work on this issue. That's difficult, but at the same time, any consulting or work outside, I think that's what Ronnie and Tanya are kind of talking about too.
Yeah, and the thing is, even though they're not poll certified, we wouldn't have to pay them URS benefits for law enforcement. Some of those are cost savings. They are very similar to a law enforcement officer. They would have to have a vehicle. They'd have to have equipment within that vehicle. They'd have to be able to call in and be reported for their safety. And so there would definitely be operating costs to get people out enforcing those. And maybe we split them with parking enforcement as well. So, I mean, there's ways to do it, and it's just a matter of what our priorities are and where we spend our money.
And one other point on the enforcement is that we have previously not had the equipment to do enforcement of our noise ordinance. And so for the question as to why potentially we haven't enforced it previously, is we don't have the equipment. And I know the chief has done a ton of legwork and coordination with the county about the equipment, and has some idea about how much the units would cost. Chief, can you address that?
Yeah, I can. Thank you. So as we've delved further into this, the equipment realm of this, we've learned a few things. And one of those is that, you have to have a Class 1 meter for it to be acceptable in court. There are various price points for Class 1 meters, but you also have to have auxiliary equipment, such as an anemometer to measure wind speed. And as it goes with anything involved with law enforcement that is potentially ending up in court, everything has to be certified and calibrated. So we have to have the Class 1 meter, which is certified and calibrated on an annual basis, but you also have to have a anemometer that is certified and calibrated to record the wind speed, and then that would also have to be calibrated on an annual basis. And so, initially what we thought would be about somewhere, between $4,000 to $4,500 for a kit, for a single kit to do noise enforcement, has ballooned, for lack of a better word, to about $8,800 per kit, so that you have devices that are providing consistent readings. The $8,800 kit, the anemometer is integrated with the noise meter, so that when you, as well as a printer, so that when you take a reading, a sound reading, it will also print the sound, the decibel level, as well as the wind speed and all the other pertinent information on the receipt, for lack of a better word, that the machine will provide to you. So it is going to be more expensive than we thought originally, but it'll provide a more solid information that would stand a better chance of surviving should a case go to court.
And I want to be clear especially with what the chief just said and what I've said. By the time we hire people, set up an ALJ, get that court process going, buy cars, buy these meters, like the idea that we're making any revenue off this proposition is absurd. I just want to be clear, like we'd have to write noise tickets for the next 10 years and not buy anything new to recoup our costs.
It feels like Les is going to explode if I don't call him respond. Go ahead, Les.
Yeah, sorry. So the only thing I would add is that most communities actually do use a type 2 meter in noise enforcement. And I would never recommend buying the cheapest type 2 meter out there, but you can do noise enforcement with a type 2 meter. The difference between a type 1 and type 2 meter is the accuracy. And so what having a type 1 meter does, will it allow you to not have to give away a couple decibels to the noisemaker, right? So basically, in a rough approximation, let's just say it's about a 1 decibel error for a type 1 and a 2 decibel error for a type 2. It's not exactly that, but let's just call it like that. So one way to get around using a type 2 is just that if let's say your limit is 55 or whatever, it might be your property standard, it might be your distance standard, who knows? Somebody goes by you or you measure 56, then if you're measuring with a type 2 meter, that's not a violation because you're not convinced the accuracy of the meter is sufficient. But I think you can probably get away with roughly 1,000 to 2,000 for a kit per kit. You will, I think the chief is absolutely right. You should get them calibrated each year. You should get a calibrator, you should get a meter. But I think that the meter manufacturers salivate at selling communities type 1 meters, and it's not necessary.
Brett, do you want to respond to that?
My only question to that would be if there is any case law regarding type 1 versus type 2, and whether or not anyone has challenged the use of a type 2, and if so, where that happened and what the outcome was.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. One way to deal with this is you just specify in your noise ordinance that the measurements be done with a meter that meets the ANSI S1.4 noise standards. And that's the standard that identifies both type 1 and type 2. And both of those meters, the type 1 meter and the type 2 meter, meet that. Now, the cell phone meter that the cell phone app on your phone does not meet that. And the cheap old Radio Shack sound level meters do not meet that. But all you do is you just specify that that's the meter, that it has to meet that, and that is generally what's done. And I would say I don't even know of a community that's relying on type 1 meters, because it just becomes very expensive. That's what I use. That's what people in the industry use, but it's not what I've seen communities using.
And I think this discussion shows exactly why we've brought Les into the discussion. As we move forward and draft this ordinance, we let Les work with Brett and the county attorney and myself and Lori, and as we use his expertise to hone in on exactly what we need and what we can use in certain situations.
Well, and I just want to say too that we've kind of we've segued into looking at law enforcement or enforcement of the noise ordinance. So unless any other council members have questions, do we need to continue the discussion around the noise ordinance, or should we sort of continue talking about enforcement? So just back to noise ordinance, more about noise ordinance. Karen, and then back to Ronnie again.
It's more about enforcement. Sorry, Mayor.
Okay, so Ronnie. Also,
sorry, mine's enforcement too.
Okay, so anything else about the ordinance, Kaylin?
I just wonder if Lori and the other staff are clear on, or if they need more clarity on what types of noise enforcement we want included. Are we at that stage? Or do you want to continue to talk amongst yourself and with Les and whoever you deem appropriate and come back to us?
No, I think we're right there, Kaylin. I think you guys giving us direction of what the standard needs to be gives us a target, and the target's what we're missing.
Well, and I'll just throw it out to council too. Unless there is opposition to looking at standard vehicle sound as Ronnie presented, or a range between a Prius and an F-150, or the like. Is there anybody that is opposed to that area, that standard area? Mike, you're opposed to that?
No. What I wanted to suggest was, as I say, we have a ready-to-use fleet of typical ATVs in town, and let's put them to work. The owners have been very cooperative, and I claim it's going to be difficult to get down to real passenger car levels as much as we might all wish it. And what I would suggest is, and we can always adjust the threshold levels as time goes by, but I would suggest we do some experimental measurements at different speeds, both stationary and pass-by. And before we ever write the final value into the ordinance, we can go ahead and write all the rest of it. And by the way, I love this civil action as opposed to criminal. I think it's a great thing.
Okay, so then specific to noise, what I'm hearing is that, I just can't help but chuckle. What I'm hearing is that there is consensus among the council at those levels, but that we want to make sure that we do like a real life check and make sure that the ordinance that we pass has that the limit that we feel is right for our community. And so it's going to be a two-part writing. We're going to write it, and then we're going to have to do some kind of workshop where we stand with a potential meter, I think, and just make sure that before we pass it. So that's going to be a fun field trip, I think, but something that I'm hearing is consensus from the council, except for not Kalen.
Well, I'd like to just provide a slight amendment, and that is that I'm supportive of having a phase in for commercial assets that businesses are already committed to. Whereas, say for visitors where like their visitation to Moab City is purely discretionary, and it's their vacation, not their business of their home. And they have the option of visiting Grand County, but going to the extensive trails to the north of town still. So I don't want to set our standard limit too high to accommodate the commercial fleets, but I am open to, through our business permitting, providing a way for them to transition to quieter vehicles without unduly burdening them in the short term.
And maybe that's a piece where we're able to identify who is who, like what Ronnie was saying earlier in terms of identification. Okay, any other comments about the noise ordinance? All right, I want to move us to enforcement, and I feel like we've already said a lot, so I kind of want to touch on concluding sentiments around enforcement. I mean, besides Senator Bramble told us to enforce, that's what we hope to do. It's obviously very specific and very complicated and very expensive. Let's just outline any other expectations that the council has and direction that we'd like to give staff. Karen?
So I'm just curious. So for a civil enforcement officer, not a meter maid, I'm just wondering if it's possible to, I mean, are vehicles a necessity? I mean, can we transition into, you know, an electric golf cart? Or, I mean, is there ways that we can, you know, save money just like using the type 1 sound meters?
Definitely, we can look into that. And when I say a vehicle, I don't necessarily mean like a police car. I mean, they just have to have something that makes them mobile and can make a stop. So we can definitely look into some sort of electric, smaller unit that's far cheaper to own and operate, as long as it's street legal and provides them with a level of safety that works for them.
Like an ATV.
An electric ATV.
Electric ATV would be perfect.
Karen, anything else?
No, I'm just, trying to figure out the budgetary requirements. There's a big discrepancy, and I hope we can come to a place where we're comfortable spending the money that we need to, but not spending it unduly on, really expensive equipment.
Yeah, I appreciate that sentiment, Karen, quite a bit. I feel like there are two avenues that we need to approach. One is, of course, any sort of state grants that we might be able to get that could help us with all of this business. The other is that I've heard time and time again from ATV advocacy groups that they are willing to support Moab City in noise mitigation efforts, and that would be financial support. So I'll just make the call out to those advocacy groups now that we are looking at doing this type of work, and that we are going to need to spend money to do it, and that it's been requested of us to do it from the state legislature and from the OHV community as well. So I guess this is as much as it's a budgetary conversation. I've heard made offers, there have been made offers from these advocacy groups to support us, but we just haven't seen $1, not $1 yet. So maybe this is the place where we can really truly find that compromise we keep talking about.
The only other point I'd like to make on the budgetary issues is that we should expect that what we do is going to be challenged. And I think it's very important for us to make sure that we're spending our money wisely, but that we're not just taking the cheapest route on equipment or anything else, because while other communities may have done this and other communities and other states have done this, I think we should expect to be challenged, and we should be ready and have our ducks in a row, especially with the equipment.
Yeah. Ronnie?
I just wanted to thank you for mentioning that, because I often feel that when the legislature changed the law, because of course before 2015 everybody did trailer to trailheads, they kind of created an unfunded mandate, and they created this massive expense for us that we are now having to pay for. And it would be great if outfitters and industries wanted to contribute, but I'll just say to any members of the legislature listening, we would be happy if you wanted to kick in and pay for what that change has created. But just a few quick questions on enforcement. I had a few questions for the chief, and that is just always concerned about safety. And of course, we've unfortunately heard some stories over the past few years about, say, code enforcement officers being injured when they approach someone, if not unfortunately killed. And so I just didn't know, as a layperson, like what kind of potentially dangerous situation will these individuals be put in? And yeah, I guess that's the first question.
Sorry, I'm mousing left-handed and I'm not left-handed, so it takes me a little bit longer.
I'm a lefty, it's easy.
I think that's a very fair question, and I'm not sure that I have an answer for it, because this concept is so new that we really don't know what it would look like. I can tell you that from a law enforcement perspective, traffic stops are inherently dangerous. It's not uncommon for them to go bad in a number of ways, whether it be related to an aggressive driver or passenger in the vehicle, or passing traffic, being distracted by pretty red and blue lights and swerving and colliding with an officer or the officer's vehicle. So it is something that is certainly carries an element of danger. I wouldn't send anybody out without a vest, personally. So that is something that we would have to consider. But I also think that there are potentially ways to use those employees that may not involve traffic stops. If we could use them at checkpoints instead of officers, freeing the officers up to do other law enforcement work, that could address that to some degree, the issue of danger to some degree. So, you know, again, I think it's a good question. I don't really know what the answer is yet because I don't know, you know, what the full proposal looks like, but there would be some safety concerns.
Okay.
I think going into it, it looks a lot like a traffic stop.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's essentially a traffic stop.
Okay,
Yeah.
and I'm just going to throw out these other things for the record, and nobody has to comment unless they don't want to, but I just want to remind people, I think in 1774 in our noise ordinance, we do have the 65 decibels, but I think that's intended less for, well, I mean, I don't know, it sounds like we need to change it so we're clear, you know, if we have something separate for vehicles. But my understanding of that was often, you know, like if you have a really noisy neighbor, that was like one of the levels that would help. So I would just hope if we change to something louder that we are keeping something lower for those situations. And then just a few little things. Let's see. So if somebody was stopped and ticketed, and this is just for me and listeners to help understand, and they were above the limit, would that mean they couldn't ride at all in our valley, or they could trailer to a county trail? I guess these are some of the things I'm kind of thinking through down the line. People probably just need to know, like, can I not ride at all in your valley, or can I trailer to a county trail? And let me just see if there's something else. Oh, and then I just had a question for the chief about, thank you very much. I wanted to thank your department for being more, or at least it may seem to me that way, and I apologize if you're always that way and I just didn't notice, but it seems like there's been a greater presence in the last few days, and maybe I was just, you know, stuck in my house too long and not out enough, but it does seem like there's been a greater law enforcement presence, just enforcing speed limits, or maybe, you know, I'm sure you're doing other things out there, but thank you. But one of my questions was, the city still has a fair variety of speed limits. We, I think, have signs up now, 15 miles per hour for OHV, but then we have a lot of streets that are 20 miles per hour. We have some that are 25. I can't remember if Williams Way is still 30. But even though we say we're a community without designated routes, it seems like when you have certain main streets that are 25 miles per hour, it indirectly creates designated routes because people want to go faster. But the thing that happens with noise too is that you will have people who say, come off of City Market, and I'm going to be totally selfish here and use an example I know well because I live on 200 East, but they come out of City Market, they go up 300, which is 20 miles per hour. They can't stand the fact they have to go 20, so they zip across 200 East, which is one of many streets that has no speed limit signs at all. And because if you get to 100 South, you can go 25. But it does kind of seem to me from a resident perspective, when they're all different like that, people speed up in certain places where you have that divide between 20 and 25. And I just didn't know from a law enforcement perspective, if there's ever a scenario where it helps if we just make everything 20, which of course is, I know it's a whole nother ball of wax because a lot of people don't want to go 20, but I just, since you're here, I'm asking.
I don't think it makes our job any easier. And honestly, I think that would be a more fair question for engineering.
Okay.
You know, we will enforce whatever the speed limit is. So if it's 20 on one street and 25 on another and 30 on the next, then that's what we're going to do. But from the perspective of should they be more consistent, I think engineering would be able to provide a more educated and informed response.
Okay.
Okay, we are at 6:40, so we need to speed through, but I do feel like the noise ordinance and enforcement was kind of the meat of the city sandwich. But I'm going to push us on through. So the third thing we were going to talk about was visitation data. And I'm just going to go ahead and take this if that's okay with everyone. I've been talking with USU for over a year now about working with them to count the number of people that visit Moab. And what I heard in the last several months was, gosh, be careful with the actions that you take around noise mitigation, because you might, bite the hand that feeds you, or, disrupt your recreation economy by these actions against, this one particular user group. And so I feel like it's very important for us to have a fact-based conversation, not just about the number of visitors, but also the type of visitor that we are welcoming, because whether we're dealing with impacts within the city from climbers or bikers or jeepers or rafters or whomever, it's really important for us to have that data moving forward. And so I'm actually coming to this council with a request that we consider a partnership with USU, where we are looking at not just visitor data, but more specifically type of visitor data. So we can make really informed decisions, not just with noise, but with all things as we're moving forward. USU has some great staff right now, really amazing research faculty. And I'm not sure if any of you joined me, I think it was almost like 2 or 3 years ago, where there was a presentation where they were using cell phone data to track visitors and to collect visitor behavior and to locate what are the hotspots, not to be confused with UDOT hotspot funding, but the hotspots of where people are visiting most, because you can look at where they're taking their pictures. And so they have more data, they've collected more data and from more locations. And so USU is really set to answer this question for us. But it would be us in being a good partner. We might have to put out some funding for a collaborative study and a little bit of staff time to work with USU for that partnership. And so this is a request to council. I just want to know if there's consensus in moving forward with USU to have them come back to us with a proposal for that effort. Is anyone is anyone opposed to that or want to speak to that in favor? Karen?
Emily, I mean, there's been many times that we have tried to figure out, I mean, with our planning, to try to attempt to do wayfinding signs, how to, I mean, having the data is so important in so many aspects, and I fully support it.
Amazing. Tawny?
I too support it. I think it's important to take the city and the county out of this because USU doesn't have, they're a neutral party, so to speak. And they're not viewed as having an agenda or a perceived outcome. So I think it's a great idea to just take the city out of it and let them do the research and just be the partner and get raw data.
Amazing. Is anybody else, is there consensus among this council moving forward with that? Kaylin?
Oh, I just wanted to express support as well for USU presenting a proposal for this. But in slight counterpoint, it seems like as the Travel Council moves from a destination marketing organization to destination management, I know that prior to pandemic, that Elaine was looking into doing better, getting better a baseline of visitor information. So, and I really believe the intentions are good. It's data and just being a better manager. So I do wonder if there's another partnership opportunity here.
Glad to hear you say that because USU is already collaborating with Elaine and that's going to be part of the proposal.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Any other comments about that?
Yeah, a lot of stuff. I think it's a good idea, Emily. I would suggest that we carefully specify what it is we hope to learn. I don't want to spend, tens of thousands of dollars, for example, just to find out if we've learned what we already knew. So,
nope, it's going to be how many people come to Moab annually and what are they doing? So
okay, sure.
It seems like it would be a pretty easy question to answer, but it's complicated. Okay.
It's never simple.
I'm moving us right along. So number 4 was coordination with others. I don't know that we really need to have much discussion about that at all. I know that we are all very interested in supporting our county and our public land managers in getting organized. I know we've had discussions about being at the table and part of the conversation, specifically when we talk about if we were to go back to trailering OHVs to trailheads or recreation areas, is there enough parking? And so unless anybody is opposed to this, it's important for us to seat somebody from the city on any committee or in any conversation as appropriate where we are invited, and that we, you know, invite ourselves, I suppose, to participate in those conversations. Does anybody have any objection to that sentiment or comments to just kind of add to it? Awesome. I think we're all very hard on the same page, or very settled on the same page with coordinating with others. And so as we agree to sit on committees or do that work, let's be sure that we update the spreadsheet where we have our listed committees or groups that we attend meetings. And remind me to do that when you say yes to serving on any committees moving forward. Okay, I wanted to just give 5 minutes where we popcorn other ideas that we've heard. So I'll just start us off. So from vendors or from residents, here are some other things that we should be considering. We don't actually have to go into much detail about them, but one thing that vendors have said is that they're willing to stage and rent like a shipping container and stage OHVs at trailheads. So while that's out of the city limits and not our jurisdiction, that's something that we can support, through our coordination with others and our participation with like land managers. There is a factory in Provo that manufactures electric UTVs. So that is very exciting to hear, and something that we can look at developing a relationship. I've always said I want to coin what is the Moab model of OHV, the Moab OHV model. So maybe there's a place for that. And then also the Honda Talon has an attachment that goes onto the muffler. It's called an NSL, not so loud. It's actually, it literally is called that. And so the manufacturers are starting to respond. So I just wanted to say that, maybe a relationship even with Honda and working, we have a relationship with Jeep, and it's called Jeep Safari. So maybe there are ways that we can continue to try to work with manufacturers. And I'm certainly committed to going to that factory in Provo and also digging deeper into this NSL model to see if we can't get them to Moab to do some demonstrations. So what from others? Ronnie?
I'll just read this list. Let's see, one idea, and I wasn't sure about the email we got from Joel, if this was part of it, but one suggestion was a town hall just for education purposes so people could have some question back and forth. On our tool list, I think our business licenses and still the question about fleet size. I think you're going to get to that later. Just looking at the resident comments, there was a question. I think it's an interesting one to entertain. First, thank you to the residents for their role in lobbying and reaching out to legislators this year. But there might be opportunities in the future for us to work more closely with residents, because it sounds like there maybe are some communication we could improve on there. One resident suggestion, I'm just throwing these out, was a resolution demanding local control. And then I thought this was a good education opportunity. I'll let one of you hop in if there ends up being time, but there's still, I think, confusion out there that one county in the state is still allowed to keep OHVs off the roads. And I do believe Salt Lake County started that way, but I think that was later changed. So it's always good to help clarify that for people listening. Other suggestions, use some TRT to help build more parking lots for trailers. I will have to say that my preferred solution to that is actually using this as an economic opportunity for our community and encouraging more outfitters to offer local jobs and shuttle vehicles, because that creates local jobs. It can be a good job, as I understand from the bike guides who are running shuttles. And so I would hate to use that economic opportunity. It just seems like it's benefits our community more than if we build a bunch of parking lots, because I don't think anyone's building extra parking lots for all our other users. And then just to remember that the manufacturers of OHVs don't actually want these on our roads. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Then there's just a lot of educational opportunities in terms of materials. I sent you guys all a Leave No Trace poster that's out there, but I know the Travel Council can do a lot with that. I know Ride with Respect is looking into trail volunteers. So just lots of things. That's it.
Thank you. Others? I think we're going to continue to get suggestions, and I think it's important for us to look into those, especially when they come from our, within our community, from our vendors, from our tour operators, and from our locals. Okay, well then we're gonna do this land use or, I was gonna ask though, does any council member at this time wish to revisit the speed limit change? Just want to make sure we're still moving forward and feel good about the speed limits. Great. Okay. So the land use ordinance and the fleet size, is anyone interested at this time to look into and provide direction to staff? Ronnie and then Kaylin.
Well, yeah, and I'm going to let other people speak, but I just know residents have been letting me know that they want to keep every tool on our list. And I mean, I know there's some different ways to approach, noise metering, maybe picking up on different vehicles that, eventually exceed our ordinance, and that may suffice, but there are also ways to look at that through business licensing. But people have asked that the land use resolution and the fleet size not come off the tools list.
Kaylin?
Well, I was going to echo that I'm continuing to hear that. And it seems like part of this is that confusion possibly that a moratorium is not a permanent solution, at least in terms of the land use application. It's time limited, it's an emergency measure to develop the permanent solution. And so in that respect, I wonder if Lori would be willing to opine as to whether you think that the fleet size and other aspects of business management are better handled via the land use code, business licensing, each for different aspects, and how fast you think those could be implemented.
And because of where we are with time, and because I know this is an agenda item for our strategic planning, is it okay if I put a pin in that?
It's okay with me.
Okay. Karen?
Could I just make a comment that I'm still not in favor of limiting fleet size at this point? The 131 units that our ATV businesses have in Moab is not our issue, and it's potentially the 250,000 registered UTV visitors in the state of Utah that come and visit Moab. So I just want to make that very clear.
I'm not interested in managing fleet size. That's managing inventory. We don't manage how many t-shirts people sell or hiking boots or water bottles. And
so it feels like not fleet size, but maybe we still want to have some discussion around where UTV businesses are allowed in our commercial districts.
Possibly that, and I'm not really opposed to some kind of incentive to help them transition to quieter vehicles over a period of time in regard to their business license. But it appears to me that the manufacturers are listening, and if we can assist our local businesses in that transition, I think that's a better tool to use than a club.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to just say future agenda items to kind of summarize this workshop and moving forward. We do have on our agenda for our strategic planning a continued conversation around this. And so perhaps what we can do at that meeting is just, Joel, if you want to prepare kind of, this is what we heard, so that we can just say, yes, move forward with that. That could be super helpful. Like Joel said, the Planning Commission is going to consider moving the noise ordinance from chapter 17 to chapter 5, and then that will come to us at our next council meeting.
Chapter 8.
Oh, sorry, chapter 8. Why do I say 5? And then, Laurie, what are the steps for the rest of future agenda items? Or Joel?
So I think for our what we've got is direction to work on at least the revision of the noise ordinance aspect, to have that revised and back to you. And then the question, I think the issue is how quickly we can get that to you, and if there's further discussion about what that looks like at any of the strategic planning.
Right. And council, we are planning to have a public hearing on vehicular noise at our March 23rd meeting. So I do intend to put that as a public hearing so that members of our community that are watching tonight that would like to make comments based on the strategies that we've put forward, that they can make comments on that, because then I'm hopeful that on April 13th that we may take further action, perhaps to approve a new noise ordinance, because I think SWIFT is important as the season is upon us. Ronnie, I'm sorry, it's 6:58.
Just real quick, we're running out of time, but I realized you didn't get to go over the other ideas like access points and stuff. Was the hope that we would either get to that in the retreat, or that would just be a future meeting? Just because I know those were points you wanted to cover.
Yeah, just that we're going to continue to get suggestions that we will listen to and roll around. We're going to have that public hearing. So, I think at this point, if anyone hears suggestions from residents or community, that welcoming them to speak at the public hearing could be very effective for us. In case, what are we missing would be the question that I would ask. So yeah, and we will still have our meeting. If in case we missed anything tonight, we have our strategic planning meeting as well, where we can cover any items. And unless there is anybody just dying to say something right now, we will go ahead and we will transition to our regular public meeting, which starts in less than a minute. So we'll sign off here, and I'll see you all at our next Zoom call.